Chapter 10 is entitled Communicating for Results. Communication is the process of transmitting information and meaning. Vertical communication is the downward and upward flow of information through the organization. It's considered formal communication because it is officially sanctioned transmission of information. Horizontal communication, in comparison, is information shared between peers. It is the coordination that goes on within a department, among team members, and among departments. The communication process consists of 4 parts. The sender, who is the person initiating the communication, encodes the message, ideally in a manner that the receiver will understand. The sender then transmits the message through some channel to the person or group receiving it. The receiver, aka the person who gets the message, tries to decode it and understand it or interpret it. And then the final part is whether or not they give feedback, and I'll talk more about feedback later on in the lecture. There are 4 primary channels for submitting messages. Nonverbal refers to body language, so that's facial expressions, gestures, and posture. Oral communication channels are face-to-face interactions, meetings, phone calls, etc. Written refer to emails, memos. Back in the day, they used faxes or newsletters. We've evolved since then, thankfully. And visual, finally, are things like television ads, posters, websites, etc. So here, the image of this guy weightlifting, the people around him, the nonverbal and oral communication, or at least the nonverbal from the picture, indicates the pretty high level of intensity, trying to pump this guy up so he can lift this massive amount of weight. The message receiving process consists of 3 parts. When you listen to the information, you pay attention, try to avoid distractions, watch for nonverbal cues. In analyzing the message, you essentially try to figure out what in the world they're talking about. And third, checking for understanding. So first of all, you need to wait until you hear the entire message, and then you want to paraphrase and watch for nonverbal information. So in this instance, this coach looks like he's telling his players some strategies or some tactics. So the players would want to listen, think about taking the information that he's giving them, and then check to understand by asking him questions about what he just told them if they didn't understand, or just paraphrasing the information back to him. Garber's article is some supplemental information not found in the chapter, but I thought was important because it discusses the nuances of listening. And you have 7 levels. So not listening, as it implies, is people aren't paying attention or they're ignoring the other person's message or communication. Pretend listening is making it seem like you're actually listening when in reality you're not. And partially listening is focusing on part of the other person's communication, only giving it part of your attention. Focused listening is giving the other person your undivided attention to his or her communication. Interpretive listening is going beyond just paying attention, but really trying to understand what the other person is saying. Interactive listening is being involved in the communication by asking clarifying questions or acknowledging understanding of the communication. And finally, engaged listening is being fully engaged in communication, which involves listening to the other person's views, feelings, interpretations, values, etc. In engaged listening, both parties are given the opportunity to fully express their views, feelings, and ideas. And I think we've all gone through, in certain instances, or been in various stages of listening, depending on what the situation is. In terms of response style, so how you respond to other people's communication, there are several different ways you can respond to messages. Advising responses provide evaluation, personal opinion, direction, or instruction to people, where you're just giving them some information or helping them get along. Diverting is when people switch focus to a new message, and usually that's appropriate when you're uncomfortable with the topic, so you basically try to change the subject. When you probe, you ask the sender to give you more information about some aspect of the message, so you're asking them more specific questions so you can make sure you get all the information. And a reassuring response is given to reduce the intensity of emotions associated with the message. So if a person is lacking some confidence or they've been in an upsetting situation, you want to reassure them and make them feel okay. And then a reflective response, or a reflector's response, paraphrases the message and communicates understanding and acceptance to the sender. Reflecting in your own words leads to the most effective communication and the most effective human relations. So you're paraphrasing and really thinking thoughtfully about how to respond. There are 4 primary barriers that block communication from the encoding standpoint. The first is terminology. This is when people don't understand the language that you're using. So maybe you're using too much technical jargon and they don't know that. You need to find a common language that people understand so that they can interpret the message appropriately. Second, information overload refers to when you give people too much info at once. So you may want to dole out the information in parts so that they don't feel overwhelmed, so that they can understand the message. Third, logic and order. So making sure your message is logical, orderly, so that it makes sense to them. And finally, choosing an appropriate channel. With all sorts of technology now, there are a number of different ways in which face-to-face communication has been eliminated. So you want to make sure that you use the appropriate channel for the type of message that you're giving. So really important messages like promotions or firings should be done face-to-face and not via email or through Twitter. And here you get Jim Harbaugh, and this tone and nonverbal communication will definitely impact the encoding of the message as well. So if you're yelling and screaming at a referee, his body language is pretty intense, probably not going to send the right message to the ref. There are several barriers that block communication from a decoding standpoint. So first is lack of trust. Lack of trust can occur for a number of different reasons. Regardless, that impacts whether or not the person is willing to understand and receive the message that the sender is giving. That lack of trust often leads to failure to listen. So if you are a physical therapy patient and you don't trust your physical therapist or physical therapy assistant, you may not listen to the advice and the instruction that they're giving you, which could in turn delay your rehab a little bit longer. And then emotions refers to when people are, in some ways fired up or sad or what have you. They're too emotional to understand the message. Maybe the timing isn't right, so they need to wait a little bit until they calm down before they can understand the message that's given. And then finally, distortion is when you take part or all of the message and then you twist it to something else that it wasn't originally before. Feedback literally feeds back to the sender the original information, meaning, and intent transmitted in the message. You can check understanding through feedback by questioning, paraphrasing, and soliciting comments and suggestions. So you're asking the person you're trying to talk to some questions to make sure they understand what you're saying. You're asking them to paraphrase the information so that they repeat it back to you in a different manner so that, again, it shows that they understand the process. So again, in a physical therapy environment, it's important to make sure the person understands the exercise that you're giving them and what they need to do when they're not in your direct vicinity. So when they go home, what exercises they need to engage in order to get healthy again. In order to solicit good feedback, first you can encourage good questions by praising people when they ask them. If they're asking insightful questions, you tell them they're doing a good job, so it's positive reinforcement. Be aware of your own nonverbal cues, so if you're giving information, make sure your body language is consistent with the information that you're giving, and then recognize the nonverbal cues in others. So if someone's slouching in their desk, arms crossed, head tilted back, they're probably not listening to you very well. Or if they're fully engaged, leaning forward, looking at you, that tells a different story. In terms of soliciting feedback part 2, you need to give more examples if they don't understand what you're talking about. So if the first time you explain something, you get a blank stare, try to give up another example that connects maybe more closely with the person's experiences. That could help. Ask if you or me questions. So what would you do if you or me in this situation, for example, and try to get them to think about your perspective from their perspective. And then finally, again, back to that paraphrasing component. So have receivers paraphrase your message so that they can tell you what you've told them to check for understanding. According to Kathleen Hessert, 75% of each workday is dedicated to communicating with others. In addition, 75% of information that people hear, they hear imprecisely, which speaks to the importance of practicing communication and listening skills regularly. Soliciting feedback is an important component for open communication.